This is ChangeMakers with Katie Goar, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
Today's changemaker is Laura Foote, founder and executive director of YIMBY Action, a national grassroots organization that is fighting to make housing more accessible, more affordable, and more abundant. Through YIMBY Action, Laura helps turn personal housing stories into action, pushing communities to a yes. Laura, welcome to Changemakers.
Katie, thanks so much for having me.
It is an honor to have you because this is one of the acronyms that everybody talks about. Your housing activism or your grassroots efforts is really getting a lot of traction, but you've got a personal experience. Let's just kind of start there, and then we'll start to tackle all the different areas.
Yeah, I think it's worth going back to the beginning when we started getting active. I think my story is a pretty normal one. I moved, to my third city. I had a husband at the time who had gotten a job in San Francisco. And so we moved to San Francisco and we could afford the rent because he had a high income, but I was just working entry level. I was working a sales job at Yelp and I couldn't afford the rent on my own. And none of my friends, I had a friend who was living with an ex who was getting erratic. I had a friend who worked at coffee shops who, there were 6 of them in a 2-bedroom apartment. I had, and these are like normal stories and the stories that people tell themselves are ones of like personal failure, right? There's something wrong with me that I can't get do we curse on this podcast? Let me start that.
You know what? It's funny because I think if we don't curse on it, I think we are driven to sometimes. But we'll try to keep it PG-13 rated. How's that?
Okay. People tell you that the SHIT, I'll spell it, right? They think that there's something, oh, I can't get my stuff together. And so that's, oh, I need a better job. And then, okay, sure. And also housing is out of control expensive. And so we were sort of like, okay, we need more housing. And San Francisco is not building housing. And every day there are proposals to build housing. And the NIMBYs, right? This term, not in my backyard. People were coming out to oppose those housing projects and say, don't build this. There was no average people just coming out and saying, we have a housing shortage, please build more housing. And that pretty simple message of we have a housing shortage, it's affecting me personally. My rent is too high. Please build more housing. Was novel. People were surprised that we were like stunted millennials coming out and saying, please build more housing. And the movement really snowballed. We started endorsing candidates, advocating for legislation, and really saying we need systemic change to get more housing built. And not just in San Francisco, not just in California. It turns out it's a national catastrophe that we are chronically underbuilding housing in America, especially in high opportunity areas where there are jobs, there's opportunity, and communities are saying no to housing production. We're here to say yes. We're the yes in my backyard. We need more housing. We need it yesterday, and we need it for tomorrow.
Housing is such a technical and intimidating concept, but then when you also break apart the pipeline to get more housing, it turns into this uphill battle both ways, so to speak. So I appreciate that you're taking the personal stories of 6 people living in a 2-bedroom and trying to say, hey, this is a group of people who would like to be able to have housing but can't enter it. And so it's like a different twist when you hear their personal stories of what's trying to happen and how people are trying to find housing, basically. Do you find that there is more difficulty trying to build new housing, or like where's the crux of the problem happening for you?
Housing dies the death of 1,000 cuts. So we start out with restrictive zoning that
Okay.
says, in many places, single family home only zoning, but all kinds of restrictive zoning that limit what can even be proposed. Then even within what's the limited amount that can be proposed, you then have permitting problems where it'll take years to actually get to a yes, and every step of that permitting is a negotiation process where the developer is, putting together a community benefit package, AKA a local bribe, right? They're putting together, so all of those things add up and increase the cost of housing, because those, the permitting timelines and the uh, instability, right? What am I actually going to be able to build is unclear. And all of that drives up the cost of housing. Then you have taxes and fees that we put onto housing. So local governments are like, oh, developers don't vote. So what a great group of people to put taxes on and put impact fees, transfer taxes, inclusionary zoning. All of these things add up. That also drives up the cost of new housing. So what pops out the end of that process is way less than demand, way more expensive. It's just a little pittance at the end is what pops out when, like, if we had more liberal zoning, if you could build taller, larger
Right.
buildings, more units at the beginning, that would help. If you made the permitting process fast, fair, and you just followed the rules, you get your permits, that would be a huge impact. If you reduce the fees, that would be a huge impact. All of those little threads we need to pull all of them because we're millions of units behind. I mean, the demand is just way outstripping the supply of housing in America.
And when a community says no to housing, there's such a ripple effect, not just through the people, but the labor and through the market and even homelessness. So, like, it's not just this one person in the one unit, it just sends a ripple through the whole community. And the people that are infected are often invisible in some regards too, because you're adding longer commutes, you're having nursing shortages, you're having teachers that change jobs midstream because they want to work closer to their home because they can't afford to live in the community where they're teaching. I mean, like, it just sends this
Yeah.
whole shockwave through the whole community. Um, how do you how do you get in front of that? Like, is it possible, or as a community, what is it that they can do to get in front of this?
I do think, I mean, more so there are people who already are putting the dots together, right? The YIMBY movement is made up of people who already have put the dots together that the housing shortage is driving the teacher shortage, is
Right.
driving mega commuting, is causing all these problems. And all that they need to do is get active in their community and demonstrate for local officials, right? The local elected official who might have an individual housing project in front of them is like doing this political math. They're like, well, there's 80 people here opposing it and nobody's here supporting it. So I'm going to say no, right? And so we can just change that political math by having a handful of people saying, actually, this would benefit our community.
Mhm.
That then shifts the dynamics also, the narrative wise of like connecting the dots that there everybody, I talk to NIMBYs every once in a while who never want to be called a NIMBY, right? That's the first thing they'll tell me is that they're not a NIMBY. They just have concerns. And I'm like, okay, let me hear your concerns. And their concerns are, aesthetic, or they're worried about parking in the neighborhood. And they have sort of a particular concern about a particular housing project. And actually, you can really open somebody's mind when you're like, I hear that you're concerned about parking on that block, but I'm really worried about the fact that nobody my age can afford to live here. And
Mhm.
your kids have had to move away,
Right.
and you're missing your grandchild's first steps because your kids can't afford to live here. And that does, people have not necessarily connected those two dots together before. And they're like, you know, your small businesses in town are struggling to hold on to staff because nobody can afford to live near the jobs and opportunity here. And so is some teenager going to commute, an hour out of town to work at the ice cream parlor. No,
Right.
right? That's like your entire local economy is
Yeah.
unraveling because of this. And I do think that people, as that narrative gets out, as sort of as people write, they write in the national newspaper, but then they also need to write it in the local paper. Here's how it's affecting our community, and really help people connect those dots to be able to see that when you block housing, you're cutting off your own future, like so many cities and towns in America are struggling right now because of the affordability crisis that's driven by this tendency to say no, that is really something that you could just wake up tomorrow and actually say, actually, we are going to be the community that says we're going to allow more housing.
Yeah. When you think of transitioning from a not in my backyard to a yes in my backyard, there's glimmers of hope in certain communities, but are there patterns that you're noticing about those types of communities? Is there something in the secret sauce? Is there a pattern that you see, or is it truly just still case by case?
I mean, I think the pattern is that this there are people who want to pretend that this is like a technical issue, that there is like, there's some policy that we can sort of micro make a policy that makes everybody happy. And like, unfortunately, this is a political issue. And so the question is like, what are our values? And do our policies reflect our values and get us the outcomes that we want? Do your local and state elected officials see that politics is one in which elected officials, for better or worse, try to do what they think their voters want them to do. If their voters are demonstrating that they will get punished for approving a housing project, then okay, they won't do it. And so I think it's really incumbent on the voters to get more active and to demonstrate, when, your state elected official, right? Go and talk. They're very accessible, right?
Yes, yes. I mean, and what's interesting though is that when officials come to the ribbon cuttings
Right.
of these properties, especially if they're new construction, renovation, that they realize, oh, that's what this is. Oh, that's what housing looks like. Oh, that's what housing does. So there's several organizations. Yes, once you identify who they are and you actually invite them to some of these ribbon cuttings, you do see a change in mentality there.
I mean, I think this is where like making this issue political and bringing other people in. So, like the AARP has realized that older people are deeply affected by the housing shortage, and they have become housing advocates. And that is like so incredible, right? They realize that when grandma wants to move into an apartment so that she can be self-sustaining, and when nursing staff want to be able to live in a
Yep.
community, right, that this is really hurting older people just as much as it is younger people. And so they've come out strong for housing. Sometimes some large employers are starting to say, we have a housing shortage, we have to do something about it. I think if more employers joined that chorus, that could make a huge difference. It really affects their bottom line. They're unable to hold on to and retain staff. That's something major for them. All of these people coming together into that chorus of a coalition is making a difference across the country. We're seeing I think good incremental change. So, Virginia is the latest state to adopt a Yes in God's Backyard bill that allows churches and religious organizations to build housing and largely subsidized affordable housing. That's a great, first step. A lot of states are adopting legalizing backyard cottages and casitas and ADUs. That's another great little step. In order to really address the chronic housing shortage, we're going to have to take bigger steps. But the initial steps demonstrate that there's an appetite and an interest in addressing the housing shortage. And I think the pattern that I'm seeing is that you really start to see the bigger these wins snowball, right? Once you demonstrate that an elected official is going to be rewarded for prioritizing housing production, then people get bolder and bolder and bolder. And so I think that initial steps, then we talk about missing middle, then we talk about, more technical. I don't know how nerdy your audience gets, but stink density bonuses and laws that allow for more housing near transit. Those kinds of you have to build the political will and demonstrate that people want you to solve the housing shortage.
The example you mentioned in Virginia with the Yes in God's Backyard, you are seeing hospitals, nonprofits, churches,
Very good.
what I would say have been non-traditional players coming into the affordable housing space through necessity, through desperation. And it's great because you are bringing people more into that ecosystem. But you think that there are a group of people who maybe are waiting on the sidelines who also need to get into that ecosystem. What would you say to them, or where would you point them if they were still sitting on the bench, so to speak?
In this issue, anybody who wants America to have a thriving middle class to be involved in this fight. I mean, it is so cross economic, cross generational. The housing shortage is hurting literally everyone, even the people who think that they're benefiting, right? You might be a homeowner in a community and you think that, oh, well, my home value is going up, so I'm benefiting from this artificial scarcity. They're also being hurt, right? Your kids are being hurt. The
Yep.
fact that businesses in your town are falling apart, you're also being hurt in other ways that maybe you're not translating back to the housing shortage. Um, and I think that's kind of like the universality of this, and that it's there are many problems that are really complicated. This is like very pure policy. Like we could just make different choices, right? It's not like, I feel like COVID and things, there's like some external factor that like, something might happen to us and no, the housing shortage is self-imposed. We shut down housing production over the past 50 years in America, and we could just change our policies. And I think there's something very uplifting about that while frustrating. That like there are many problems that we have ideological differences about. In fact, this is one where whether you're a far leftist who thinks that we prioritizes equity and social justice, you should be pro housing because when we have a housing shortage, it disproportionately affects low income and minority people. Whether you're on the far right and you believe in private property rights and you're like, somebody who owns a piece of land should be able to build what they want to build, right? Come into this tent, right? We have a big tent. And in fact, it's a really wide ideological spectrum that can come to a pro housing perspective.
I would say that at least the good thing is that everybody is talking about it right now on both sides of the aisle. And so there's a lot of room for deal making when it
I
comes
mean,
to
we
policy
just
because there used to be a time when many of us who have been in this industry for decades upon decades is we were like with the megaphone and talking and nobody was listening to us for decades. So at least the tide has changed where people are talking about it. And there is a lot of deal making to be had. There's people who are talking about policy, but you're right, this is an issue that impacts everybody's constituents, the
I'm
underemployed, the middle class, seniors. Like it impacts everybody. And we're all getting smarter in the housing space as it relates to density and zoning and all those nuances. We are getting smarter about that, but we still haven't turned on that production pipeline quite yet.
So to this kind of like bipartisan, we just as of Friday passed in the US Congress, hugely bipartisan pro housing bill, the Road to Housing Act, overwhelming bipartisan majorities in both houses. And the bill has a lot of complexity to it, and it's sort of a good like nudging bill. It's going to be nudging a lot of communities to build a little bit more housing. But what's really significant about it for me is that it passed overwhelmingly. Everybody's acknowledging that we have a housing shortage and that, the federal government, that's like, it was when's the last time we had a broadly popular bipartisan bill pass Congress? Like, I don't know. There's got to be some statistics on this, but it really makes me excited for, next year. I think we're going to see bolder legislation, more bipartisan work. All of the pro housing bills that have been proposed in Congress have had a Republican and a Democrat as co authors on them. And so I think that, should the to the degree that there's hope for bipartisanship in America, it really is in this
Yeah.
pro housing category where there's
Right.
just a lot of opportunity.
Right. And it's interesting because there's this piece of, hey, we passed something, now let's all not take a sigh and sit down like,
Mm,
oh, a collective sigh. It's like, no, that's the baseline to
right.
build on. And so we as affordable, we're in the compliance space, we're not in the policy space, but every single policy impacts us. So we are in this portion of time where we have to say, let's create that the baseline. And now let's keep refining it if it didn't get right, or let's keep adding to it and building to it. No pun intended, I suppose. So you have 87 chapters. Tell us, what are your goals there? How do you want to expand? Like, how are you organized when it comes to that? Because I know part of how you're organized is also part of your success.
Yeah. So we have 87 chapters. Each one of those chapters has at least three local volunteer
Okay.
leads who are managing that chapter, are, having local meetings, getting the members active in that community, supporting legislative changes in their community, supporting individual housing projects as they're proposed, and then endorsing pro housing candidates. And so that network of activists is really pushing the ball forward. We're seeing legislative success in Colorado and Illinois, Virginia, California, of course. California had 200 plus bills this past year. Not all of them were good, but that kind of moving the ball forward by demonstrating that there's in district support and supporting individual housing projects. We also have a legal enforcement arm, YIMBY Law, that when cities don't comply with these new state laws, we go so far as to sue cities and say, actually, you have to follow these new state laws that are demanding that we build housing. We do a lot of implementation work. So, you'll pass a state law that requires cities to update their zoning. Then you have to go into each community and say, hey guys, knock, knock, knock. Did you actually update your zoning? Are you actually increasing housing production here? That's the activists in the community demonstrating that there's people who actually think this is important. That is the lion's share of the work, right? So YIMBY Action, our staff, were providing that backbone network expertise, legislative support and technical experts. And, we have if you're into chatting with fellow activists online, we have 6,000 people in a YIMBY Action Slack that are all chattering away about housing policy. So if you become a member, you can join the Slack and find your local state where people are following state legislation and, pumping each other up for the next lobby day, what have you.
Well, it's such a kind of, I would say, um, diversion from our normal podcast guests because, we're mostly proposing different types of innovation or housing. But I think having you on here has helped us really talk about what is needed, what are the obstacles, and I think about this though, like what are the metrics? Like if you're going to future cast in 10 years or 5 years, what are the metrics by which you can look back and say our movement, getting people to say yes in my backyard made a difference and it changed fill in the blank. Like what would you say for your future vision casting to be able to show a metric that you're like, you knew you guys made a difference?
Yeah. So we track, there's a lot of input things that we track, right? Number of activists, number of chapters, number of bills passed, right? I would even consider that an input, right? The bills are nice, but they're not actually units of housing. Um, the stat that we follow that makes sense internally, but I feel like it's so hard for people externally, is units unblocked, right?
Oh,
So these are projects that we did some kind of activism. We touched it in some way. Maybe somebody came out and gave a public comment. Maybe we sent a letter of support. Maybe we sent a letter threatening a lawsuit, right? Those are
okay.
units that were getting pushback, and we consider them, and they are now have their entitlements secured. So
Hmm.
last year, we had 66,000 units that we consider unblocked, that we helped push towards entitlement secure. So that's, I think, the number that I keep an eye on, that feels like our North Star. Now, what's hard about that number is once we actually solve the problem, we're not going to be unblocking anything because they will just be unblocked. So eventually we'll have to shift to, America's housing production as our North Star. But for now, I'm keeping this number of units unblocked as something we're really focused on. And hopefully in 5 years, I can switch to just total housing production.
Hmm. I like how you said that with the North Star. And I'm assuming that's both new construction and preservation, or is that just your
That's
new
just new
construction?
construction.
Oh,
So,
wow. Okay.
we try to be really militantly focused on production. There are a lot of great organizations that are doing preservation work, and there's not enough who are focused on the undersupply of housing in America. And so YIMBY tries to be, we support preservation, but we are really focused on production.
Well, Laura, we have covered a lot. Is there anything that we've missed as we're closing out that you want to add on here?
I mean, it sounds like your audience is the kind of people who would love to like nerd out on floor area ratios or whatever. So,
Yeah.
um,
They like to nerd out on anything housing. So we're
and like, finance and whatnot. And we do have, we're trying to take that energy and make it politically relevant. And so I
okay.
think that like people who love to nerd out on housing policy, you have a home in the YIMBY movement. We're just going to make you give public comment also about how housing personally affects you. So, these are that balance of when to pull out the chart and when to say, actually, we need to tell more personal stories, and make sure people know that housing is political and personal, and that if we don't solve America's housing shortage, we're all kind of doomed. It's
Right.
necessary, and the next generation is counting on us to solve this issue.
Well, a good housing policy that provides an affordable market is a great economic policy. So, like, we have the links here, the data's there, the needs there. So, we appreciate what you're doing on the policy side and the education and awareness side. Something that never goes away, does it? So, we're glad to have organizations like you.
Thanks for having me, Katie. This was great.
Thanks for listening to ChangeMakers with Katie Goar. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.